Hi, this is John Romano, and I'm recording a lecture for my course in medieval history entitled Ruling and Administering England. And normally at the beginning of this lecture, I have students watch what is known as the animated Bayeux Tapestry. And you can find a link to that on the Blackboard site of the class. And I think you'll realize the relevance of it quite soon in the course of the lecture. Here today, we're going to be speaking about England in the second phase of its development that we're seeing in this course. And we're really going to see the end of what is known as Anglo-Saxon England. What would change, what would bring an end to Anglo-Saxon England and change England forever was an event known as the Norman Conquest that all of you will know took place in the year 1066. And just to give you a brief background to how this all came about, this is a coin of the king that is known as Edward the Confessor. Here's another example of Edward the Confessor. Edward the Confessor's mother was a sister of the Duke of the area of northwestern France known as Normandy. And for a certain period of time, Edward would go across the Channel and live at the court of the Normans, an area, of course, that had been founded initially by Vikings, by Scandinavians. When Edward ended up coming back to England, after having spent this time in Normandy, we really see that many of the nobles who came from Normandy would become frequent visitors, and some felt even became favorites at his court, receiving all kinds of lands and offices. And this kind of this closeness would annoy nobles in England to no end. We think that perhaps in part because of the closeness of this relationship, Edward's cousin William, shown here in the Bayeux Tapestry, who was the Duke of Normandy and quite a powerful and able man on his own, he really begins to feel that he is the logical successor to Edward in England. And Edward himself has no children, we think that that is at least part of the reason why he thinks he's the logical person to follow him to the throne. Another of the reasons is that William will claim that Edward at one point would promise him that he would be allowed to succeed to the throne. To understand this, we have to understand this kind of interesting competition between nobles to decide who would get to be the King of England. This other noble family had a son named Harold, pictured here on this coin, who ended up wanting the throne of England after Edward's death. The only reason why this didn't come to be likely was that at one point Harold would end up becoming shipwrecked in the English Channel. And he was captured then by a vassal of none other than William. What William would later claim was that Harold, shown here, supposedly swore to him as the price of his freedom that he would aid William to become the King of England upon the death of Edward. And in exchange, William would still allow Harold to be one of the chief nobles of his kingdom. And so, upon the death of Edward, when Harold decided that he was going to seize the position of king himself, William dispatched messengers to the Pope, claiming, in fact, that Harold had broken his oath. Now, you may wonder why the Pope wanted to touch this at all, and we do think that it was useful for the papacy at the time to try to get friends in as many places as possible. And so, in fact, to have a friend in the form of William, who wanted to become the new King of England, seemed quite tempting. William promised to be cooperative toward the church in the future. We also see that the church, again, really inspired by this kind of reform ideology that we discuss, wanted to enforce uniform laws throughout Christianity, throughout the realms of Christianity, for instance, in sexual ethics, for instance. And one way to do that was, of course, to have a compliant monarch on the throne. Now, just because, though, that William had the idea that he was going to go ahead and conquer England did not mean that that was suddenly going to come into being. And when William makes this call to all these people who are supposed to give him aid in battle, his vassals, many of his vassals would refuse to go. And rather legalistically, they would claim that although they did owe him service, they never owed him service across the sea. And so they refused to go with him on this what seemed to be a foreign expedition to England. I'm really not losing faith, even in spite of this major setback. William then would issue an invitation for all kinds of adventurers to join him. And then he got a great army together, collected a great fleet, and then he waited until the weather was such, the conditions were such, that he could then invade England. We see at this point that in the course of this long waiting, because Harold knew that this fleet was coming, Harold could not simply remain in the south to engage William as soon as he came. And in fact, Harold ended up having to go to the north to confront an army who was led, believe it or not, by first of all his own brother and also the King of Norway. And he was able to fend off that attack, that invasion of England. But this really left a window for William to then cross over without being molested at all and to enter into England. And so then, with an exhausted army, we see Harold going and meeting William at Hastings. Initially, we think that William made little progress in this battle, but then at one point William decided to feign retreat, and his enemies, the enemy forces of Harold, would break ranks. And then William's very heavily armed knights would plunge into the gaps and begin to cut the infantry into pieces. And then, as part of this battle, Harold would end up dying in the battle with his own men. You can see here, for instance, he has an arrow through his head. And it would then take a few more years for William to subdue rebels, but after this point, he would be known as William the Conqueror. And just to show you here again, this is Normandy, where he had come, and of course this is England. To keep order in this new territory that William had just taken, he would erect all sorts of castles to be able to watch over people. And one of the ones that is best known to us today is the Tower of London. At this point, if you were lucky enough to be one of these people who had come from William, you would be rewarded handsomely for your services. And he began to give out all sorts of land to the people who had fought by his side. And really, he was very careful then to make sure to reward loyalty by giving out land in strategic locations that would help him to defend his own territory. And as part of this process, we also see William would then dispossess many of the people who were previously on the land, many of these Anglo-Saxon nobles. As part of giving out these lands, as was common in Normandy and in most parts of Western Europe, he would require feudal services along with the rewarding of land. And so England began to get all sorts of new lords that again would kick out the natives who had previously been in charge of the same territory. And so most people would tend to say that it was after William that England becomes a much more feudal state. But the one way in which feudalism was a very different kind of creature in England than elsewhere in Western Europe at the same time is that unlike other places where we had seen that the monarchy had become extremely weak or virtually disappeared, like in France, instead, although these feudal principles were still there, in England we have a centralized monarchy. The king in England is going to be more wealthy and more powerful than any of his vassals. He'll have more land directly under his control. He will have an efficient administration that will serve him ably. He will have the ability to tax his lands. And he will ensure, this is very interesting, that after William, all of the vassals would have to take an oath directly to the king. So he was everybody's lord. This kind of new efficiency in government that William would import with him into England can be seen especially in what is known as the Domesday Book of 1086. I often refer to the Domesday Book as the most successful tax audit in history. What we see is that William sent out forms to attempt to get information about all this new territory that he now owned. And just as with tax forms, many people chose not to return it. And then after this point, William would end up sending out his own royal officials to go throughout the territory and gather up detailed information about the resources of each district of England. And the main point of this was not just to survey the land out of interest, but to know what he had so he could tax it better. And this survey that he took, we still have, and it is still a gold mine for historians who want to know about the state of England at the time and to get some idea of its population. We then see that again William's family will take over. It doesn't matter that he's in charge immediately, though, in as much as many of those people there, many of the nobles in particular, will still have to be crushed in battle. So William, even after the initial conquest, will still have to fight. We see this next king we'll discuss, Henry I, to some degree, is still involved with this same process, still going to war with all sorts of rebellious barons or nobles, and in some cases having to exile rebels. But still, Henry I managed to perpetuate the power of royal government in England. For instance, establishing royal justices to hear cases. So creating law is very much part of what the king had to accomplish. We also see under Henry I development of effective financial administrations. He created new officials to be able to handle money, to really, in some cases, to pore over the accounts that he had to make sure that The king knew exactly how much money he had and how it was being used. Unfortunately, Henry I had no male heir, and what he did before he died was make all the nobles in England swear allegiance to his daughter, Matilda, pictured here. But unfortunately for Matilda, upon Henry's death, yet another claimant, Stephen of Blois, would counter the forces of Matilda in battle. And this Stephen of Blois was Henry I's sister's son and a cousin of Matilda. And so, in essence, during Stephen's entire reign, he was involved with a bitter civil war with Matilda. This is bad news for the monarchy, in that the monarchy, for a period of time, is disunified. But it was an absolutely fantastic opportunity for the barons, the English nobles, who really, in some cases, would go to both monarchs to try to sell their allegiance, and whichever one would provide a better offer, that would be the offer that would be taken. And so we see nobles beginning to carve out territory of their own that the king could not touch. And we see lords, lesser lords, beginning simply to plunder the countryside, recognizing the king and the other king were busy battling one another. This period, sometimes referred to as a period of chaos, would finally end with an agreement between the two parties. First of all, Stephen would reign to the end of his life, and then after that, Matilda's son would take over, and the son was known as Henry II. Henry II, as the result of having married extremely well, would end up having vast lands in both England and France, in southwestern France. And most people would also say that Henry II was really a masterful personality, and really, in some sense, the strong ruler who England needed at exactly the time he comes to power. And so, at least some people think that during the Henry II's reign, the royal power really goes to its highest point since the conquest. And Henry II takes the opportunity to begin to counter all of the power of the nobles in the time of the battle before his reign. He begins to, for instance, destroy illegal castles that had been built, or in some cases to take them into his own hands. We also see Henry II being very careful now to choose people who were loyal to him in government. He also is constantly thinking about questions. This is a penny of Henry II. He wants to think about how to increase royal power in every direction. For instance, very interesting form of taxation. He demands money when nobles want to give daughters in marriage. He collects certain fees of anyone who wants to attack in France. And he even at one point attempts to increase power over the church, but this is really one of the areas in which he perhaps advanced too quickly and perhaps not cautiously enough. We really see that Henry II wanted to have control over ecclesiastical courts in particular, that in his own day would handle very important issues, for instance, having to do with things like marriage. And ecclesiastical courts were independent of secular ones. Interestingly enough, Henry II ends up being opposed by none other than Thomas Becket, who, interestingly enough, was once one of the king's servants, his primary servant, and he ends up becoming the chancellor of England. And to make things even more interesting, Thomas Becket had once been a personal and close friend of the king. And Henry II taps Becket to become the Archbishop of Canterbury, the most important clergyman in England, largely because he felt he could trust him. Just to show that these things work in very strange ways, it appears that the office of Archbishop actually ends up transforming Thomas Becket. And strangely enough, he becomes pious, generous to the poor, and willing now, in a way that he had never shown any propensity before, to fight for the rights of the church against the king. And this irritated the king to such a degree that Thomas would end up actually being driven into exile in France for a certain period of time. And then finally, some of Henry II's knights would actually end up killing Thomas Becket in his cathedral, something that Henry II had not really wanted. It seems that some of his knights had ended up just taking matters into their own hands, but Henry II will be forced to do penitence for this really what was seen as a sacrilegious act. After this point, Henry II would end up having to compromise with the papacy, and really he would have to allow English ecclesiastical courts to allow people to then appeal to the Pope. Was something that annoyed him a great deal, but he had no choice. I should say, though, that most people would say that a lot of Henry II's measures, when it came to royal secular courts, though, were far more effective. And in fact, courts in England at this time would actually increase the amount of business that they were undertaking. And in the course of his reign, some of the basic institutions of English law would actually come into being, especially, perhaps most importantly for the future, the creation of jury trials. And many historians would actually find under Henry II the beginnings of what we know as English common law, a law that is called common because it applies to all people equally and all regions equally. This would outlaw some of the practices that were still common elsewhere in the medieval world, for instance, using a trial by ordeal to find judgment. Really, again, common law did not have to be written out in all its particulars, but there was meant to be a general understanding among the people of the realm over what was legal. We think that Henry II's government becomes so powerful that many barons begin to chafe under the amount of royal power that they had to face, and Henry actually ends up suffering a rebellion led by his youngest son, and with many barons end up joining in, and this actually ends up being suppressed successfully, so they do not overthrow him. Henry II ends up having two sons, both of whom most people would say were very different creatures. And this is the first of the two, known as Richard the Lion-Hearted. If there is a commonality among these two sons, it is that both of them aimed to continue their father's policy of building up royal power. Richard, we think, was someone who was liked by contemporaries, and perhaps even more so by people after his death. But most people tend to think, as a king, he certainly had some blind spots. His personality was frank, he was open, he was generous almost to a fault. He was known as being handsome and a patron of poets. Supposedly even wrote some poetry himself. Richard was perhaps the ablest soldier of his day, and so even those people who did not like him feared him, which is a good position to be in. And Richard would end up going off on a very successful crusade. And this was not the only instance in which he found a way to stay on good terms with the church. We do see, though, that strangely enough, for a king of England, Richard seemed to always want to be elsewhere. In the course of a reign of 10 years, he actually ends up spending less than a year in England altogether. And so the real delight that Richard seemed to have was that being a king gave him the resources then to go off and fight. War was his pleasure. And he then was able to use England as a piggy bank to be able to go off on crusade, and then also get involved eventually in a series of bitter wars in France and to defend the territory that the English king had in France. I should also say that Richard really did not have any trouble with barons because not only did they like him for the most part, but no one was going to be stupid enough to be able to attack someone who was so good on the battlefield. The next king, John, was in some very interesting way a more able king on the whole than Richard, but someone who was viewed as extremely unpleasant and not really liked well. We do think John, much to his credit, worked hard at the business of government. He sat in courts religiously. He looked over finances very carefully, and in fact was known as being something of a penny pincher. He really squeezed out new finances wherever he could find them. He, in some cases, created new taxes, new customs, even created new officials then to begin to collect money for him. Unfortunately for John, though, although as you can see from this image, he was fine at hunting, he did not have the reputation of Richard as a valiant fighter, something that really was still at this point an absolute necessity for a medieval king. And unlike John, who did very well fighting against the French, the wars that John got involved with on the continent were complete failures. And perhaps symbolically the worst of his defeats was when he lost Normandy to the French king. And Normandy, which of course had been the origin of this entire family. There had been their ancestral land, which now had fallen out of their hands. And after this great defeat, he was often referred to by the term John Softsword, which, trust me, was not meant as a compliment. We also see that John was not good at playing the game with his own barons. We think that he would not forgive barons even after they had asked for forgiveness, which really ultimately meant that few of them trusted him. In some cases, he would actually seduce the wives and daughters of his own vassals, which, in addition to many people thought was immoral, was also a little tacky. At one point, too, John ordered the murder of his own nephew Arthur. All of this would eventually boil over into open revolt, and in 1215 there was an armed revolt of the barons who occupied London. And John simply had a vacillating response. He really didn't know what to do in these circumstances. And there's a whole bunch of issues that have been mentioned here that raised their ire that the barons saw an opportunity to resolve with the king. And so the barons demanded in their articles that the king make all sorts of concessions to them. And John really felt at the time he had almost no choice except to accept them. And they drew up a formal charter then to embody these new reforms that was known as Magna Carta. I won't say all too much in this context about Magna Carta because you are going to read it and take part in discussion boards on it. Perhaps, though, the greatest lesson of this document, and one that in some way has resonated, is that the king was not above the law. John and later kings after him would be under the law just like everyone else. And here's just one image of Magna Carta. The next king I'll discuss, Henry III, was a weak king. Most people tend to think Henry was governed by friends and his favorites. And we really see that many of his relatives take advantage of this position to obtain all sorts of offices and lands from him. And Henry was not half so careful with money as, for instance, John had been, and he would very generously, and perhaps over-generously, give money out to the church. Many barons, English nobles, really resented the kind of favor that Henry would show to his foreign relatives and the overall extravagance of his court. And in some cases, the barons felt that really offices and rights that were meant to go to them were instead going to whoever Henry III favored at the time. The barons then began to take stronger measures to try their best to limit the king's power. And eventually, one man, Simon de Montfort, shown here, who was an earl, would become the leader of this aggrieved party. And for a period of time, Simon actually forced the king to accept a baron as the head of the government and royal administration. In fact, Simon and his forces would manage for a period of time to defeat Henry in battle and capture him and keep him in prison. For a period of time, in fact, Simon and his allies would actually rule England in Henry's name. Simon de Montfort, in some ways, appears to us to be a man out of his time. He said things about these dreams about England being governed by a feudal class, and that would work as a whole for the good of the realm, which could not possibly come into being at the time, and certainly was something that never came to be. And we think, though, that in time his position became significantly weakened when he could not hold the barons together. Really over far more mundane matters. For instance, there would be quarrels over money, who got the most amount of money, and many barons, in fact, began to feel that Simon really wanted to illegitimately limit their authority, which they resented. Eventually, in this time of confusion, Henry III's son, known as Edward, would take advantage of the situation. He would negotiate with some of these people who had become unfriendly with Simon. And then after that, Edward would gather his own army. In fact, Edward was someone who was a man of first-rate capacity as both a soldier and a statesman. He ended up then with this army moving quickly, surprising Simon's sons, dispersing their army, and then meeting Simon's forces on the battlefield. Simon was killed, his party was destroyed. And as you can see, all of this was fairly violent. At this point, what we're going to see is that in the wake of all of this, kings in the future are going to begin to summon what they refer to as parliaments, which were drawn from a wide base of nobles and knights in England. And in fact, they were meant to actually broaden the base of power of the English king. What we're going to see is that these parliaments will be called then to approve special taxes, to assist the king in the governance of the realm, to settle all sorts of issues regarding law and administration, and to support the king in crises. Interestingly enough, parliaments were brought into being to support the king and to show how many people were behind him. And in fact, in the early callings of Parliament, they were absolutely dominated by the king. It really was, in fact, a very slow process by which those people coming together in a parliament would actually use the parliament as a way to limit the power of the king. And in particular, by using that power to be able to say whether or not the king was allowed to raise special taxes. The purse strings are going to become the force of the parliament. And of course, as many of you will know, the eventual sort of power the parliament would have would be one of the linchpins of democracy in England in time. We are still in the Middle Ages, though, so moving away from monarchy now and moving away from democracy now and getting back to monarchy. This is Edward I. Edward I, after coming into power after this crisis, would be a formidable king, and far more so than Henry III ever was. Edward ruled effectively, and in part because he generally maintained the support of nobles. With that said, we think that Edward had to recover lost ground for the king after this disastrous civil war. We really see him making an effort to recover royal rights over officials, over courts, and in fact, he really establishes that if the nobles wanted to gain any new rights, they would have to pay for the privilege in the future. The English administration would really, under Edward, be divided very carefully into specialized bodies, to things to handle, for instance, some judiciary things, some financial things. We also see, too, that, again, you already have an idea of this from his reaction in the Civil War. Edward also militarily begins to go on the warpath. In particular, most people would tend to see some of his most successful actions being in the western part of the island in Wales. We really see that previously, ever since the Norman conquest, there had been limited battles against Wales, but really Edward was just a little bit more ambitious than previous kings, and he wanted to crush them once and for all as an independent power. And we see Edward would then move his army into Wales, and he drove the Welsh into hills where they ended up being blockaded. To be able to more effectively control Wales on the ground, Edward would end up creating a line of strong castles manned by people loyal to him. It really, after having destroyed the independent King of Wales, he would end up dividing up Wales into areas that would then be given over to English nobles. And again, we're speaking specifically of this region here, Wales. The most famous of the nobles who would move into this region was the son of the king, who would become the Prince of Wales. And this is a title that would be borne by the heir of the English throne ever since this point. Another of the adventures that Edward would take part in occurs further to the north in Scotland. In 1290, the death of the last elder line in the Scots royal house would come about. And Edward, who was always seeking opportunities to extend his authority further, in this case further to the north, he really wanted then to conquer Scotland. The nobles in Scotland, really because there was some confusion as to the rightful heir, the new King of Scotland, decided, perhaps foolishly, to go and to ask Edward who should take over the throne. Rather unsurprisingly, the English legal experts decided that they would award the throne to an English noble who was descended on the female line from the brother of the Scots king. I'm sorry, this is really the point in which was something of a controversy. For this person to take over the position, he then had to do homage to the English king for the kingdom of Scotland, making Scotland subordinate to England. Maybe perhaps that wouldn't have been so objectionable, but after that point, Edward used that homage that had to be paid, the ritual homage, as a pretext to interfere in the government of Scotland. At this point, the Scots begin to raise up an army, and drive out Edward. And at that point, Edward decided to invade Scotland and begin to occupy it. The Scots at this point have a revolt against Edward, which was first crushed, but then ended up finding a leader in Robert Bruce, who was an English noble, whose grandfather had actually been a rival for the Scottish throne. And Robert Bruce made considerable headway against some of the English troops. Edward, however, we think was planning a counterattack against Robert Bruce, and he was actually marching to the north when, unfortunately for him, Edward would die on the border with Scotland. And this really gave Robert Bruce a chance to breathe and to organize his forces. When Edward I's son, Edward II, would act against Robert Bruce, in effect, he didn't have much of a base of operations in Scotland any longer. There was only one castle that was still held by an English noble. It really a great English army then was sent to relieve this last stronghold by a small brook that was named Bannockburn. and it was at this point that Robert Bruce would then utterly defeat the English army on the battlefield. And although Edward would manage really to considerably add to the territory under England, Scotland would remain independent under the rule of Robert Bruce. There is, however, one last area of English influence that we haven't discussed up to this point, and that is Ireland. Now, we have not said a great deal about government in early medieval Ireland up until this point, because really, to some degree, there was never a very strong monarchy. There were lots of small local kings within Ireland who really continually battled against one another for dominance. And in effect, it was really quite rare when the monarchy was at all united in Ireland, in spite of Ireland being a very small place. When all of this changes is when one Irish king decides he got the idea to call in English lords to be able to help his cause. Just like a bad house guest, these English lords ended up overstaying their welcome, and in fact, really began to conquer territory in their own name. Henry II, we don't think initially had planned an invasion of Ireland himself, but when he saw many of his nobles already in the action of conquering portions of Ireland, he made the relatively late decision that there was going to be an invasion by the monarchy instead. We really see at this point then that Henry II is going to become the major force in Irish politics as well as in English politics. Really, as the English begin to come in, we're going to see the same sort of feudal system that existed in England, with really a system of fiefs that were attached to lords. We're going to see English nobles coming in with their methods of administration, and we're going to see the slow process of colonization of Ireland by the English. Really, in some ways, bringing with them some of the same sort of attitudes, the same sort of trends that existed elsewhere in Western Europe are now going to increasingly come into Ireland as well. By the end of the 13th century, Ireland was firmly under the English thumb. And altogether, we tend to think that Ireland was fairly prosperous. As in other places of Europe, towns are going to begin to grow there. We're going to see the presence of guilds there too. We're also going to see English castles going up there for the same reason they had gone up in Wales, which is to better to be able to control the countryside. It is fair to say, though, that this kind of prosperity did not equally benefit all people, and really, these new English nobles that were settling in Ireland really succeeded far more than local Irish people. Really, the Irish were aware of this situation, aware of the fact that their territory had been colonized. And we're going to see in later generations this constant tension between English overlords and the Irish natives. Now, really, although the English, in political terms, we're going to see that the English are going to be extremely strong, we're going to also see that there is going to remain a sense of distinctiveness among the Irish, and many facets of their culture are going to continue unimpeded even after the presence of the English and the dominance of their nobility there. All right, that's it. Thank you.